Well, this session is going to be moderated by Prem Shankar Jha. Many of you know Prem because he has been both, coming to the new school now for a couple of times in the past few years. Of course, anyone who follows India or, is interested in Chinese story, he's a well-known, name, a journalist, public intellectual, a writer. So I'm delighted that he's going to be helping us with the last panel. So Premji, it's yours.
Thank you, Ashok. Tough job doing the last session. Trying to keep you, staying awake is not easy. At least I'm glad you're here. I'm supposed to be both a moderator and a discussant. Impossible, and I'm not going to take up the time at the end. So instead of doing that, if I may, since this is the last session, very quickly sum up what, in a sense, I've learned and the one or two questions that remain, and important ones in my mind, which maybe panelists may like to address, but even if they don't, I hope someone will from the floor. And I'll do this very quickly, but as quickly as I can, and it'll certainly be under 5 minutes. Look, all our discussions today have been centered around one question, which is why, in spite of such rapid growth, are we getting both an increase in poverty and inequality? Now, if you look at it, implicit in this question is a normative statement that the growth should have mitigated poverty and inequality. The moment you put it that way, you realize you're flying straight into the face of history. Not a single capitalist country in the world has had that experience. Please, I know someone's going to say Korea, South Korea and Taiwan. I'll come to that in a moment. They are exceptions to the rule, and very special reasons. I won't dwell on them, but they are. We've had many references to Kuznets, but I also remember several studies, one or two that I have looked at myself, of the rapid increase in income inequality differentials in Amsterdam in the 18th century, when Amsterdam was the center of European capitalism, period. If you go back further, 1478, Florence, you had a terrific revolt of the lower end of the textile working class, and it was a very large one. This took place at a time when Florence was arguably the richest, or certainly not, if not the richest, the second richest, and by far the second richest region of Europe. And that revolt was absolutely ruthlessly crushed. Now, therefore, what the point I'm making here is that there seems to be something that is missing in our understanding, because here's a rich state in which was getting richer all the time, and Florence continued to do so for a long time, in which you had a massive revolt. Here you have Amsterdam showing the same characteristics in a city-state that you find in all the nation-states today. How come? And so my first question is are we looking at enough indicators? Is income inequality, income differentials, a sufficient indicator of increasing poverty or inequality? And I want to pose something as a hypothesis that it is not. What we need to look at is insecurity. Is development creating insecurity? Or is the state handling it? Or are any automatic countervailing pressures developing which can mitigate it or not? And therefore, do we have indices also of insecurity as distinct from poverty? To the best of my knowledge, while everyone talks of insecurity, I was in China in 1993, and my minder from the All China Journalists Association and I had 3 weeks of discussions on his life, and it was a highly insecure life. The point is, but he was infinitely better off than he'd ever been before. No question about that. So I think we probably need another dimension to this debate also. The question is, erosion of insecurities comes from 2 areas. One is the erosion of traditional security nets. Anthropologists have written extensively on it. Maybe it's time we brought it into economics and political economy. The second is that state-created nets become moribund, can become moribund. That's certainly happened in China. It's happened in India, where the formal working class has been totally overwhelmed by the informal working class. The formal working class has remained stagnant. And China, of course, the exact parallel is, of course, the rise of the migrant worker. Now, in totality, what is the impact of rising insecurity? It is disempowerment. Economic development disempowers people even while it empowers people. Now, in a sense, when you say this, it becomes obvious. The moment you go into a political economy and start thinking about capitalism and the history of capitalism, what I'm saying is an obvious truism. But it needs to be, we need to remember this. And the disempowerment, the sense of helplessness turns into anger when you simultaneously see that some people who have benefited are abusing their power, newfound power, which has happened in both countries, happens in every developing country in the early stages. Yep, finished. Thank you. Now, just rounding that up, as usual, one goes on too long. The question is, the European response to this was the building of countervailing power, trade unions, democracy, hence welfare state. What globalization seems to have done is left only the second alternative to us, which is the dispensation from on top, to mitigate these inequalities. And there's been many efforts, and we've spent the whole of the morning and afternoon talking about that. And the question is, why has it not succeeded? And I'm going to stop with that and ask our panelists to take over. Sanjay, would you start? Thank you.
I realize everyone is quite tired at the end of the day, so I'll try to get through this quickly and then get to the discussion. So my presentation is straddling the state-society divide, which I think, given the presence of Vivian Chu and Atul Kohli here at least, is appropriate, given a book they had edited a long time ago, which had a great influence on, I think, on many of us who studied it at the time. And it's looking at India's new rights-based acts. Professor Lee asked earlier, why is it that democratic India hasn't responded? And my answer will be that it has responded. Whether it's adequate is another question, but it has responded. And it's responded in a very intriguing way, which is since the election of the United Progressive Alliance, led by the Congress in 2004, it has unveiled a series of rights-based national legislation, the Right to Information Act, which mandates government to release information upon its activities in a timely manner to any citizen upon request. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which we've talked about intermittently today, guarantees 100 days of wage-paid labor to any household family in the rural sector that demands it. This is important qualification that has to demand that work. The so-called Forest Rights Act, 2006, the so-called Right to Education Act, 2009, which grants compulsory education to all children under the age of 14. And then more recently, this long one, Indian bills, like many other bills, quite long, public interest disclosure, so on and so forth, basically the Whistleblowers Act. And then a more intriguing one recently, the right of citizens to time-bound delivery of goods and services and redressal of their grievances bill. So I think this is quite interesting, given the analysis, which was very illuminating, that Devesh just gave to us about the capacity of the Indian state. These are bills trying to prod it into action. And this one actually requires bureaucrats to set up a citizens' charter and also give time-bound dates for when certain goods and services will be provided with a redressal mechanism, a grievance mechanism. And finally, one that many of you may have been reading about in the papers, the National Food Security Bill, which there's been a lot of debate about. It's currently under parliamentary review. So now, what's the significance of this? I think there are three major points to think about. The first is that it undermines the distinction in principle, which is encoded in the Constitution of India between Parts 3 and Part 4. Part 3 is the fundamental rights, mostly political and civil liberties. Part 4, the socioeconomic entitlements of the directive principles of state policy. This was meant to be the ambition of the state, its aim, its conscience, so to speak. And these new bills make Parts 3 and 4 much more closely connected, and I'll explain why. The second, and this is partly why, is that these bills have been partly a result of very progressive what I call socio-judicial activism and state-based policy experiments in India's federal system, which have led to national legislative change. Another way of putting it is that a number of scholars have made the argument that social movements in India have been remarkably unsuccessful in influencing electoral politics and national legislation with certain distributive agendas. And this is an example where actually this has worked. And the third, which I think is actually one of the most interesting features of it, is that many of these bills seek explicitly to promote political transparency, responsiveness, and accountability. This is clearly the purpose of the Right to Information Act, which is not a Freedom of Information Act, and I can explain why in discussion. It's a right to information, so it's a positive right on what you would consider a civil liberty. But then you also have certain governance mechanisms, for instance, in the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which allow communities to socially audit the works of the local state. And you even have, that very long bill, the last one you saw, bills that are happening both at the national level and the state level to grant citizens certain rights to public service delivery. And it's part of what I think is a broader state building project. I think it's a narrow project, but it's still part of a state building project we've seen. Again, quite controversially for many, the Uniform Identity Authority of India is trying to grant a biometric identification to every citizen of India. Many of you will, this is probably the equivalent of the Beauchile scandal in China for India, in the sense of how much it's gripped public attention. The Anna Hazare movement, we've had a rather heated debate, some of us the last couple of days, how to interpret this, but this broader anti-corruption movement which has swelled up in the last year. The Second Administrative Reforms Commission. So there's a lot of activity here, addressing the kinds of issues that I think Devesh very rightly put on the agenda for us. So 3 obvious questions. Why now? One argument's often been that in any democratic system, particularly a democratic system where the poor are a majority, you would expect this to happen, but why? But it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened for 5-6 decades. Why now? The second, which I suppose is implicit in the second question, why rights? Why the language of rights versus entitlements? Why make it explicit? And how are these rights conceptualized and how are they operationalized? This is very crucial as well. And then the third, I suppose, are what are the promises and risks of enshrining socioeconomic entitlements as formal statutory rights? This is the beginning of a new research project, so I'm going to sort of try to explore the terrain more and give some tentative answers. I wish I had a tighter theoretical argument to present, but I think it's interesting terrain to explore. So this is the explanation in general. I think you can think of these rights-based movements as a result of 3 very slow-burning transformations in India over the last 2.5 decades, 3 decades, which are interwoven, and all of them have raised popular expectations, at the same time that all of them have their own inherent limitations, which in a sense is why we get these rights-based legislation. So they are basically the progressive juristocracy that the Indian Supreme Court has come to represent, often called the most powerful in the world, through public interest litigation. The second is I've joined the bandwagon, the new cottage industry of resurrecting Polanyi. I'm going to use it more as a loose analytical framework of what I'm going to call India's great transformation. It's a peculiar great transformation. It's partial. And so therefore, I think it leads to what I call a partial double movement, the counter movement. And the third is the politics of India's third electoral system. This is a phrase by Yogendra Yadav that will be known to many of you. This is basically trying to understand why is it the case since 1989 that we've seen an increase in the electoral participation of historically subordinate groups and the rise to power of many of their parties. And yet, for these questions we've been asking, why, when you have these parties come to power, have they not pushed through a distributive agenda? Okay. So a progressive juristocracy. This is a phrase that juristocracy is a term that lots of legal scholars have been using in recent years. I think Ron Herschel has popularized it more than anyone. And this, basically, India for the last 3 decades, it's a complicated, exciting terrain. I'm going to summarize it very briefly. The Supreme Court has become very activist. and there are lots of qualifications, but I'll be a bit more blunt just for presentational purposes, in a quite a progressive way. And it's done it through two ways. One is a substantive reinterpretation of the Constitution. It has read a lot of the directive principles of state policy in Part 4 through the fundamental right of right to life, which is Article 21 in the Constitution. So it has tried to make those entitlements justiciable by reading them as integral to Part 3, which are fundamental rights. The second, which has drawn a lot of attention worldwide, is public interest litigation. And there are three crucial procedural innovations here in India. One is relaxing the norms of standing and pleading and the notion of aggrieved persons. You don't have to suffer a personal injury yourself to bring a case before the court. In fact, you can even send a postcard from prison. And the judges, this is a very famous case in the early 1980s, epistolary jurisdiction, where that would even be entertained as a formal writ petition before the court. The second is that the court has appointed fact-finding commissions and monitoring reviews to force the executive to actually pursue some of the cases that have been put against it. And in some cases, most controversially, it's actually assumed executive power as well. So, as I said, I'm going to run through this very quickly. How do we assess this? Well, there's been a lot of gains, and these are the limitations. One, of course, is that there's an inconsistent stance of the Supreme Court towards what we might call pro-poor issues. This might be partly because of a structural bias of the Constitution. This is actually a phrase that Neera Chandok herself uses, and I've borrowed it. Partly it's the organization and character of the judiciary itself in India. The second reason is the character of jurisprudence. Unlike the South African Constitutional Court, the Indian Supreme Court does not have a doctrine of systemic social rights. This is a point that Madhav Khosla has made in a recent article, which is very illuminating. It has what's called conditional social rights. The court will haul up the executive for an obligation that it has made but has violated by not discharging fully. But it does not press the state to take upon obligations that it hasn't already taken upon itself. So this is the idea that the rights violations are conditional upon state action or state inaction, better way of putting it. And another aspect of its jurisprudence is the rights are often unspecified. Many legal scholars have pointed this out. They say, if you try to look for, well, what does an environmental right mean for the court? It doesn't really spell it out. It just says that a right has been violated. But when you look for the content of the right, it's not often clear in the jurisprudence. And this has, of course, led to these risks and problems of accountability and capacity. This is a phrase of Pratap Mehta. Actually both of his phrases. The judicialization of politics in India over 3 decades has led to the politicization of the judiciary. It's gone from being a regulatory institution to being an institution of governance, and therefore it's become politicized. The second, and this is a sort of black joke, black humor that goes around the circles in Delhi, the due process is the punishment. The backlog of cases in the court is extraordinary. I mean, the figures are actually mind-boggling. I think it's 20,000 for the Supreme Court, and then you're into the millions as you move down the chain. Okay, so that's the first big, slow-moving transformation. The second, I will spend very little time on this because we've talked mostly about it today, but I would simply focus on the fact that the service sector has really led a lot of the boom in India, and this is important for these rights-based measures. The champions of the new Indian economy are often information technology, business processing, and the technological aspect's very important, as I'll talk about in a moment. Ramifications, I'll just highlight 3. One, of course, is material. There's a lot of debate on how we measure poverty in India. The most recent Planning Commission estimates have only added fuel to the fire. But there has been a general consensus that the absolute poverty has declined, but there's a lot of debate about exactly how much, depending on how you measure it. The second, which I think is very important, is a growing faith in progress, at least amongst the urban middle classes. This is, of course, very palpable in India. And actually a faith in technology. I think this is quite widespread. I met a government officer working at the UN from India recently, and he said the problem we have is we don't have enough bandwidth. I thought it was a very revealing phrase. This is the language of the IT sector, which is infiltrating how even government officials think about state capacity. And the third, which many people have pointed out, which is very true, is that with rising growth, you have rising tax revenues and therefore the possibility of expanding basic social programs. At the same time, this is of course what we've been talking about, persistent mass deprivations in India, both in terms of income and socioeconomic opportunities, growing inequalities, I don't need to mention that, we've talked about it all day, but also, and this I suppose is worth highlighting, that liberalization, according to most of its neoclassical economic backers, was supposed to reduce corruption, because we always thought, according to them, let me rephrase it, they always thought that a permit license Raj was the cause of corruption. But of course, corruption has expanded in terms of its opportunities with liberalization, like everything else, both high and low. We only have to think of the scandals of the last 18 months to see the most recent corruption scandals. So this has led to what I call counter movements from above and below. This is a play on Polanyi. It has led to counter movements from above, if we think of the judiciary, which clearly is part of the high state in India, increasing judicial censure and intervention. But it's also led to civic activism, which straddles the state-society divide, and of course it has led to a Maoist insurgency in many parts of the country. And what about the politics of the third electoral system? As I mentioned, one of the most striking things about India in the last 2 decades in particular is the rising electoral participation of historically subaltern groups. It's actually more likely for someone who's historically marginalized to vote today than their better off classes. This is a real inverse of, if not an electoral law, a high electoral probability of every other democracy in the world. It's also led to the rise of many new state-based parties and the increasing relative power of regional communist and socialist parties, which are driven by the lower castes in India. And it has also led, of course, as many of us know, the contrast to China couldn't be more stark, at least in a visible sense, an obvious, explicit sense, to party system fragmentation and high electoral volatility. The decline of single-party majority governments in India. These are the largest coalition governments in the world. Many don't last a full term in office. They range anywhere from 7 to 23 parties with multiple ministers. There's very little unity in the cabinet and so on. We know a lot of this. It leads, when I think about China, to a kind of ironic reflection, which is that India is very hard to understand because everything's on full display. And China politically is often very hard to understand because you don't know what's really going on behind the scenes. So in India's case, it's the opposite, but everything is reported in the media. So what were the achievements and shortcomings of this third electoral system? One is greater political self-representation, what Christophe Jaffrelot has called a silent revolution of the political class. You see this, as Christophe and some others have very ably documented the changing composition, for instance, of state assemblies in the national parliament. And you see, in terms of lower caste composition and minority composition, quite a dramatic change. The question of Muslim representation is the caveat. The second is that the struggles for recognition by lower caste identities, and here I'd want to put some emphasis. We've talked a lot about class today. Caste, of course, is crucially important, both positively and negatively in Indian politics, to understand class dynamics as well, I think. And here I think there have been some very important achievements. The changing calculus of personal dignity between caste groups, collective self-esteem, and a reordering of the status order. And we can talk in discussion about so many indicators of this in India over the last 2 decades. The fact that chief ministers from the lowest castes are actually now being elected into office. But this has been the limitation of this movement. It's raised popular expectations. It has actually brought in incredible energy into the political system. It's expanded Indian democracy, but it's not necessarily deepened it fully. And that's because the politics of representation and recognition have been greater than the politics of redistribution of basic material assets and the expansion of socioeconomic opportunities. Many of the lower caste parties in particular have focused on reservations and have neglected the kinds of issues we've been talking about, investments in health and education and so on. So those are the sort of 3 big transformations. How do we think about this new rights agenda? As you can see, I haven't really told you a whole lot about the bills themselves, and it's partly because I knew I had so much time, but hopefully we can talk about it in discussion. The promise, I think, I'm listing 5. This tells you how new this project is. The first is the innovation of rights per se. These are actually new rights. They don't easily fit into standard dichotomies of political and civil liberties and social and economic rights. They actually fuse some of them in interesting ways. The second is that many of these rights-based acts actually specify the institutions and mechanisms which are necessary to realize them. They're often insufficient, but the fact that they do is quite interesting. Many critics of rights in general say, sort of invoke Bentham, very famous claim rights are nonsense upon stilts because you just invoke a right, and who's supposed to guarantee it? Well, many of these laws actually try to show who is responsible and how are they responsible for cashing in these rights. The third is that the law, and this is important, these are laws as opposed to policies or schemes, incentivizes, I think in many cases, new progressive coalitions to form. This happens, of course, in the electoral arena, but it also happens across state-society divide. I've already talked about judicial activists and social activists working together through public interest litigation. You also, I think, starting to see it, at least maybe this is my hope more than fact, between reformist bureaucrats, for instance, many often who've left the bureaucracy to join civil society groups who then try to then change the state. You think of people like Aruna Roy, Harsh Mander, and others. The fourth is that it might create an impetus, and I think it's begun to do that. And here's where the debate is very live, about if these rights are to be meaningful, what systematic institutional reforms are necessary? How do we actually make them real? There's been a lot of debate about the Uniform Identity Authority of India, right? Is it a high modernist nightmare, as Atul mentioned, Jim Scott's work, right, on seeing like a state. Lokpal, Anna Hazare's movement, a sort of an anti-corruption movement which was accountable to no one in his conception. But that has also then led to a lot of debate. So there's a lot of contention over the design of these institutions, let alone how they function. And I think that's where the promise lies. This is really a space of deep contentious politics. There's a lot to play for. And I think this is, in a sense, what's the promise, is that ideally, when you think of these laws together with these efforts to improve state capacity in India, it is both trying to allow citizens to see the state better, to improve the transparency of the state, at the same time that it's trying to increase at least part of the capacity of the state to see society. And because it's doing both things at once, I think some of the dangers that Jim Scott and Seeing Like a State had laid out are at least constrained to some extent, at least in design. Again, in practice, we'd have to do the kind of work that Professor Lee had shown she was doing in China. We have to actually look on the ground to see how it's working. And I've run out of time, so very quickly, what are the risks? The Indian Parliament's great at passing laws, but execution is often its weakness. Bureaucrats have been wailing in the op-ed pages, please stop passing laws, just get them right. Second, if you make all of these entitlements justiciable, you're going to overload an already overloaded bureaucracy and judiciary. Third, this is, I think, a particular critique from the left, and this is where the old criticism of rights is true. Are you actually bolstering public spending? Are you actually, as Devesh said, increasing the manning of the state? Or is this just a new form of poverty management? You're not alleviating poverty, you're just managing it. Fourth, are these yesterday's battles? In other words, is this something that should have been done before, so let's focus on other issues? I think actually they are today's battles. I think in order for liberalization to proceed, some of this basic social security safety nets have to be put in place. But again, there's a big debate on this. And finally, I think so far it's been more of a counter movement from above than below. It's involving greater civic activism, often by ex-bureaucrats who've committed themselves to social change through the National Advisory Council, for instance, under this present government. But has it really awakened broad social movements? Does it have a wide base that can really make sure that these rights are cash out according to their promise? So I'll just sort of leave it there.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the India-China Institute at the New School for inviting me to this event, and thank you all for sticking to the end of the day. So my job is to talk about internet activism in China as a form of response to developments in China. We read very often stories about Chinese citizens protesting in cyberspace, using cell phone, using blogs and so on, quite often. So what I want to do in very brief time is to try to summarize very briefly some of the main features of internet-based citizen activism. You might call it online activism or digital activism or internet activism, and then try to talk about a few ways of understanding this phenomena. So one feature of, well, let me explain briefly what I mean by internet activism. There are basically two broad types. One is the kind of online protest activities, but then sometimes organized, at least partially organized, using the internet, using blogs and online forums. The other broad type really refers to verbal protest or critical debate activities that happen mainly in cyberspace, in online communities, online forums and blogs, and nowadays, in recent years, especially in so-called microblog sphere. So these two broad types. But under these two broad types, we can actually see a broad range, a great variety of online contentious forms. People can use the internet to make petitions, signature petitions. Sometimes activists set up campaign websites, especially consumer rights activists. Sometimes when protests happen offline, rural protests, labor protests and so on, they are covered online, sometimes covered live reports of activities that happen offline. NGOs using the web, organizing civic activities is also a form of internet activism. But the most important kind, in my view, is what has sometimes been called internet protest events, internet events or new media events. These mainly happen online. It happens, you will see such an event emerge when large numbers of people begin to debate and talk about certain issue very critically, and information spread very fast and very quickly. Mass media, traditional print media, television may also be involved in covering these stories because they don't want to fall behind the netizens. So a broad variety of these online contentious forms is one of the features of online activism in China. Second is the great variety of issues that really you see in these kind of activities. Most typically involving what is so-called rights defense, Weiquan, the defense of citizen rights of all kinds, consumer rights, but many other kind of rights, and I'll try to have a few examples. Another main issue is about corruption of government officials and abuse of power. According to some recent numbers, Chinese media scholars who have been following these kind of developments, this issue about corruption and about the abuse of power probably is the most common target of internet activists and internet protests. There are also protest activities involving environmental issues, pollution, and so on. Sometimes about cultural values, for instance, sexual orientation, single motherhood. It can also be, at the center of internet contention. Online charity is another major sort of civic activity that has been happening online. Cyber nationalism is also a major issue in this broad range of issues online. Now, to come back to a little bit about the rights defense, which I think is among the most important rights defense as an issue in online activism, certainly covers the kind of classical issues such as labor protests that Jingguan talked about, peasants in the rural areas. But there are also some new rights issues involving, for instance, homeowners protesting about their lost piece of green land in their neighborhood, forced allocation, forced relocation. Sometimes also about anti-discrimination. For instance, disabled people, people who suffer from hepatitis B, for instance, diabetes patients. These people may suffer all kinds of discrimination when it comes to job application, job placement. There have been a number of significant movements organized online to fight against this kind of discrimination. Women's issues, children's issues, and of course also, but in a rather different way, explicitly human rights issues. When usually activists don't frame their issues as human rights issues, it's rather rights issues. When it becomes human rights issues, it becomes too universal and becomes too contentious and very politically sensitive. So human rights activism is also important, but actually not as common as you see as at the other cases. A fourth feature is the frequency of these kind of activities. The media, Chinese mass media, have been actually keeping a close watch over the number of cases happening, and media scholars have been producing reports about how many events have been happening. The most recent, according to the most recent report produced by media scholars at Renmin University, last year, 2011, 349 significant internet incidents happened. Meaning that protest incidents with some significant social impact. 2010, 274, 2009, 248. So the trend is growing number of cases. So these are some of the main features that we can mention when we talk about online activism. And I want to mention now, move on to talk about a few ways of understanding this phenomenon, what to make of this. Now, with regard to the theme of our event, I think the main argument I would make is that internet activism is both an outcome of Chinese modernity, or you might say Chinese modernity in today is about the rise of China or economic development. So in a sense, a central part of this story is that it's an outcome, it's a consequence of the rise of China, of China's economic development, but at the same time, it's also a response to Chinese modernity. First, the rise of China or economic development provides enabling conditions for internet activism. For instance, the development of the IT industry is, of course, a crucial part of the story. Without the internet, of course, there's no internet activism to speak of. China was wired in 1994. At the end of the 1990s, there were several million internet users. The most recent numbers of internet users are at about 500 million internet users. So you can see rapid growth of the internet population, reflecting, of course, the growth of the IT industry, which is for the state a pillar industry. So the government has been, of course, promoting the telecommunication industry in IT, new IT industry, and this provides necessary condition for the happening of internet activism. The second condition, enabling condition, is the rise of consumer society and urban middle class with the money and time for leisure, for entertainment, but also with a new kind of ownership of housing, property ownership, and related to that, a new consciousness of property rights. So we see the homeowners activism very much integral story of this kind of the rise of urban middle class and consumer society. And consumer rights movement, of course, is also part of the story in consumer society, the rise of consumer society since the 1990s, when the Chinese government began to explicitly promote consumption as a mode of promoting national development. Previously, that was consumption, especially in the Maoist period, of course, was considered as bourgeois. But since then, it has been glorified. So in terms of these two major conditions, I think they are crucial for the development of internet activism. The second condition, the second sort of consequence of the China's economic development is that it provides grievances or targets of activism. And we may refer to this as development-induced grievances. A lot of this have come up in our previous discussions, last panel, for instance. We see the dramatic gaps between rich and the poor, the ongoing unfolding Bo Xilai case and his family and so on is part of this story of between the rich and the poor. The social justices against the disempowered, the disadvantaged, ecological degradation, land loss, and so on. But also, besides these kind of material developments, material grievances, what we might think of as non-material grievances, anxiety even among the wealthy and among the middle class, right? Anxiety about their social status, cultural anxiety, the sense of the loss of community as people knew it in the past, and consequently a greater need for expression, for a sense of belonging. All are very important conditions for understanding why people are just so enthusiastically spending time online, talking and protesting and debating. So this is another condition about development-induced grievances. And then finally, I would say a last main condition is about what has been happening in terms of political change. We see steady, rapid economic growth, but relatively slow political change. So political stagnation marked by continuing and growing forms of political control. These are also important in shaping the particular forms of internet activism. I mentioned the great variety of forms and so on and so forth. But if we take a closer look at these issues and the variety, we would also see how online activism is shaped by political conditions. For instance, some issues like environmental protection, environmental issues, social injustices, corruption, so on, they are more likely to become contentious protest events online than some other issues because they enjoy relative political legitimacy. Human rights issues, as I mentioned early on, may enjoy less political legitimacy, more political sensitivity, and therefore more limited space for political contention. So this, I think, has a lot to do with the changing political conditions, or rather political conditions that have not been changing very much. And related also to this is another very distinct feature of online activism in China, which is how internet users, netizens, try to bypass internet control, filtering, censorship, and so on, by through very creative means of publishing their blogs and publicizing information online. If a keyword like Bo Xilai nowadays is probably filtered in China's major block sites. It's now people would very easily invent some other term which may not be filtered and use that substitute, and other users will easily understand that's what that refers to. So all kind of creative ways of doing activism online. So these are the main conditions I'd like to mention. I have a few minutes. I would like to conclude by touching on, I suppose, that D word, which is inevitable in discussions about activism, especially internet nowadays, democracy and democratization. Because inevitably, analysts would ask whether internet activism and all other kinds of activism may lead to democratization or may lead to political change, political reform. So I'd like to just briefly respond to that question by way of concluding my remarks. Some observers still believe that, yes, the internet or internet activism may have this power of inducing political change. Others believe actually it will help strengthen authoritarianism by providing a safety valve for a highly tense society. And still others think that the internet is doing as much harm as good. For instance, we have cybersecurity issues, we have cybercrime, and cyber nationalism is a concern for people both in China and outside. So the question about whether internet activism, how internet activism may affect political change, from my personal point of view, I think is a very open question. I don't think there is a clear and straightforward answer. Multiple possibilities and options exist, and which option will become reality is really a matter of very complex struggles among multiple parties, not just about the internet, it's about the whole institutional environment and involving many other factors that I think a lot of the themes, a lot of issues that have come up in today's event actually should be taken into consideration in order to understand the political impact of internet activism. But I think it would be useful to recognize at least that despite political limits, internet activism does show the enormous possibilities of critical public and political discourse on the internet. Whatever political changes may happen in the future, they will probably be reflected through such discourse, if not achieved through it. We can also recognize that the government authorities at different levels now seem to be heeding to the voices of Chinese netizens. As a matter of fact, the People's Daily Online has an office, set up an office in 2008. The office is charged to monitor the internet opinions generated on the internet, but mainly for the purpose of educating local government officials about how to understand these new media events and how properly to respond to these activities. And the assumption is that a lot of the times protesters become radicalized because government authorities do not respond properly. But fortunately, as we've seen from C.K. Lee's presentation, it does seem that the government officials, at least in Beijing and Shenzhen, are now very smart in devising ways of responding to protest offline, but I think online as well. That innovation program that you mentioned is also integral to how the government is now trying to revise and reform how it manages internet activism. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
do I?
These two.
Okay, that's down. Thank you very much. This is really the first presentation that I'm making on an academic project that identified democracy and political violence in India as the core of research, and wondering whether the relationship between the two might not have to insert the notion of political obligation, or at what step should people stop obeying the state. And I'm particularly grateful for this invitation because it's only apt that I present this argument on political violence in New School, because I've been greatly influenced by Hannah Arendt and her wonderful work on violence, which I think is very, very useful, very, very useful in kind of countering notions of political violence, of structural violence, which have become very fashionable, but which actually explain nothing. Now, I do political theory, and I will be tackling this issue from a slightly different perspective, asking different questions. My presentation is divided into basically 3 sections. In the first section, I identify the notion of compound inequalities. In the second section, I identify a form of politics that seeks to neutralize these compound inequalities. And in the third section, I seek to inquire into whether this form of politics has any potential or any capacity to dissolve these inequalities. However, political theory also has to address concrete empirical problems. So I am going to, in the first 4 or 5 slides, lay out what I think the basic contours of inequality are, and then talk about the specificity of inequality in India. Now, the great Indian poverty debate takes up a lot of time and a lot of space and a lot of energy, and it has become so specialized and so methodologically driven that at least a non-economist and a non-statistician that I am cannot access it. But even a layperson can identify whether irrespective whether they're 42% poor or 30% poor, should be able to identify 4 distinctive features of poverty in India. The first feature is that poverty is regionally concentrated, and I draw upon the India Human Development Report 2011 issued by the Planning Commission and by the Institute of Applied Manpower Research. And these are Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, upon which I will be concentrating, parts of West Bengal, parts of Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. Now, these states, and there is more to income inequality, as somebody pointed out, these states are also at the bottom of the HDI indicators since 1999-2000, when the Planning Commission issued its first Human Development Report. The second distinctive aspect of poverty in India is that poverty is community specific. It's concentrated in 3 communities which are defined by birth: scheduled tribe, scheduled caste, and subgroups in the backward castes. The UNDP Human Development Report 2010 identifies 81% of scheduled tribes who live in the forested areas of central India, 66% of the scheduled caste, and 58% of the other backward castes are multidimensionally poor. Here we see a very interesting overlap, because 56% of scheduled castes and 55% of the scheduled tribe population of the entire country lives in 4 states: Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, and parts of West Bengal. Now, if you disaggregate it state-wise, the relationship between regional poverty, community poverty, and low human development indicators becomes even stark. Bihar, doing well, still lowest per capita income. The interesting thing about Bihar is it has 1/5 of the scheduled caste population of India, and they fall much below other groups in the state and in the nation. That is the national figures for the scheduled caste. I'm a little new to statistics, so if I make mistakes, please forgive me. National population of scheduled caste. Chhattisgarh, scheduled caste and scheduled tribes are 50% of the state's population. 10% of the scheduled tribe population, that is the Adivasis, the forest dwellers, live in Dantewada and Bastar, which are the highly forested, dense, hilly areas, which are of some interest, as will become apparent later on. Incidence of poverty much higher, malnourishment, low education, school dropouts, underweight, scheduled tribe children, and the STs in Dantewada and in Bastar are the most illiterate. Chhattisgarh happens to be mineral rich and a power surplus state. We come to Jharkhand. It contributed 70% of the domestic product of Bihar before it became a separate state. SC and ST population is high. Again, incidence of poverty is much higher than not only the other social groups in the state, but also national SC and ST estimates. Orissa, abundance of natural resources, one of the most poorest states in India. SC and ST population is 40% of the total population of the state, and STs are 10% of the total ST population in the state. Health conditions, education, poverty, education and health much lower, poverty much higher. Andhra Pradesh doing very well economically. SCs and STs make 25% of the state population, but incidence of poverty among both these communities is much higher. I mean, the paper is on the website, so perhaps if you'd like to look at the statistics, I hope I've not muddled them up, but there they are. The fourth distinctive nature of poverty. The first distinctive nature of poverty, it's regionally concentrated, it's community specific. There is an overlap between regional poverty and community poverty. And the fourth is the contingent nature of poverty. And that is why I'm focusing basically on the STs and the SCs. Poverty among communities of scheduled tribes and scheduled caste is based upon a contingent and a completely morally arbitrary factor of birth. So there is a causal relationship. You happen to be born into a community that has been stigmatized as the outsider, as the untouchable, as the polluting, and you are barred from any opportunity that society has to offer others. But there is a little more complexity in the link between material deprivation and social discrimination. Affirmative action policies of the Government of India, which have mainly concentrated on the politics of presence, so representatives of both these communities have a physical presence in educational institutions, in public jobs, and in legislative assembly. In Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar, and Orissa, actually, they are both denied of both recognition and redistribution. So social stigma and material deprivation reinforce each other, but they can also be semi-autonomous because some Dalits have accessed the benefits that affirmative action policies have to offer, but they continue to suffer from social discrimination. There was a research project done in 2006 which showed that untouchability is alive and well in India. And most university scheduled caste students are of the opinion that they are socially discriminated against. They might get positions into the university, but they are not welcome in the private world of interdining or friendship, let alone marriages. So it is this mixture of causality and semi-autonomy that defines compound inequality. Now, compound inequalities are peculiarly resistant to political intervention because politics can negotiate the distribution of scarce resources. It is difficult, but as history has shown us, it has been done. How does politics negotiate the social discrimination aspect of inequality? How does it tell us how to treat people in a way that is consonant with being human? And in this way, all three strategies of political intervention have failed and utterly failed. Social policy of the Indian state, there is nothing, as we have seen in the indicators. Group representation, they don't seem to have done very much for their own people. And civil society intervention, in the sense that civil society intervention, particularly the Dalit movement, I wouldn't say it if I was in Delhi or in JNU, Delhi University or JNU, but actually the Dalit movement just doesn't concentrate upon the poorest of the poor. I hate to say this, it's become a middle-class movement. And I'm not the only one who says it. Anand Patwardhan has just done an excellent documentary in which he has attacked the Dalit movement. They're just not bothered. It's concerned with privileges. The complexity of compound inequalities has been grasped and addressed by the extreme left. it is not surprising that the most intensive armed engagement in the southern part of Chhattisgarh, that is Dantewada, Bastar, Kankar, Rajnandgaon, and Narayanpur district, that are the most intensive. And this is the map which shows you, this is taken from the International Institute of Strategic Studies. And this is the map which shows you that Naxalism is intense in the most poverty-stricken areas. Now, I take Atul Kohli's argument very seriously in the morning when he said that there is no causal link between inequality and political violence. I'm completely of the opinion that this is so. I mean, every condition of discontent needs a trigger. And this trigger has been provided by the Maoists. We do not know how much political support the Maoists do have in these particular areas. I suspect it's very uneven, and fieldwork has not been done to the extent it has been done in the Naxal areas or past the Naxal areas. But in any case, there is major political violence in which people have taken up arms against the state. Now, we have to consider, when we look at Maoist violence, that we have to consider that the consequences of the triple failure of political intervention have been serious. The most marginal of the SCs and the STs suffer from avoidable harm, eke out a bare existence, continue to be subjected to rank indignities, and die premature deaths. This is as much a part of Indian empirical reality as Maoist political violence is. Into this vacuum, which has been created by the complete absence or the ineffectivity of three kinds of political intervention, have stepped in the Maoists, armed with their ideology of foregrounding the interests of the poor and the oppressed, and their strategy of political war, of a people's war, oriented towards the establishment of a people's state. And the link has been made very clear. The 2009 draft report by a subgroup 4 of the Committee on State Agrarian Relations and the unfinished task of land reform alleged and stingingly criticized the government of India for failing to aid the interests of the most marginalized, that is the Adivasis. A year earlier, the 2008 report of the expert group set up by the Planning Commission provided an equally stinging critique, and it documented that now there is Naxalism in 125 districts of 12 states. Now, there's a sense of déjà vu, because exactly the same thing had been said by another committee of the government of India, set up in 1969 after the first Naxal phase, after the first phase of Naxalism. And it said, the village is going to explode. You need to do something about the ill-being in which a majority of your own people live. Now, at first glance, nothing seems to have changed since 1967. The conditions in which the SCs and the STs live, the ideology of the extreme left, which keeps talking about a comprador bourgeoisie, or indeed the response of the state to these groups. The state then typed them as militants. Now they are seen as a security threat. But the context and the agent of change have altered, have been transformed in very significant way. The context for the third phase of Maoism in India has been the wholesale appropriation of resource-rich land and handing it over by state governments to Indian corporates and transnational corporates. POSCO, Vedanta, we all know the litany. The Dandakarania region, a forest area which borders 4 states, Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Odisha, and which covers 3 districts, Bastar, Kankar, Dantewada, has become one of the sites for the seizure of land by the state government of Chhattisgarh. I mean, the state government of Chhattisgarh is completely fascist. I don't know what small states do for people. They do a lot for the elites that they generate. It has been said, this is the biggest grab of tribal lands after Columbus in the making. And this is not an activist. This is the 2009 report of the Ministry of Rural Development. The script of the grab, and this is the committee, has been authored by Tata Steel and SR Steel, who wanted 7 villages or thereabouts to mine the richest richest lode of iron ore available in India. Now, you know, the appropriation of land and displacement of tribals in India is not new. But there is something very specific about the current phase of displacement, which has been captured by the term primitive accumulation by the late Kalyan Sanyal, who drew upon David Harvey, obviously. And the complete appropriation of non-renewable resources, iron in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh, bauxite in Orissa, diamonds in Bastar, through legal as well as illegal mining, the establishment of SEZs, processing zones, hydroelectric plants, industrial units, and the use of open-cast mining have had serious implications for tribal life, ecological devastation, and massive displacement. And we must remember what the tribal representative had said in the Constituent Assembly. I want to stress from the Adivasi point of view that land is and must be the bulwark of Aboriginal life. This is Jaipal Singh. The poorest of the poor are paying the price for India's growth story. It is in this context that the third phase of armed struggle has broken out. The second distinctive aspect of Maoism in India is the consolidation. And the second phase was fragmentation and the consolidation of two regionally influential groups, the CPI-ML People's War and the Maoist Communist Center. Now they command a larger territorial reach. The military strength of the Maoists is anywhere between 9,000 and 10,000 armed fighters, possessing access to 6,500 firearms, 40,000 cadres of the party providing support. Now, what do we make of this? And I come to the last part of my presentation. You know, it is, I think, political violence is morally a very ambiguous concept. I do work in the realm of normative political theory, and it's a problem. You know, when you have entrenched inequality that wrecks the lives of the poorest of the poor, is political violence always wrong? Even Gandhi, I've just done a paper on Gandhi and violence, and he was so nuanced. I mean, he talks of everything from pest control to euthanasia, as long as your intention is all right. It is here that the Maoists have launched a two-pronged project. The first project is doing what the Indian state should be doing: land to the tiller, enhance producer prices, getting better prices for forest produce such as tendu leaves, hemp, and of course, revolution, kind of radicalizing the means of production. The second is equally important, and that is recovery of self-respect to people who've been handed down disrespect as their patrimony. I mean, that was what the scheduled tribes and the scheduled caste in that part of India have been handed down. Considering the extent of ill-being that stalks the lives of the poor, considering that both the state and civil society groups have done little to ensure well-being, and considering that among the SCs and the STs in that part of India, central and eastern India, there is more denial of self-respect, more infant mortality, more malnourishment, more ill health, more illiteracy, and more premature deaths, is violence always wrong? But I am not going to enter into that debate, which is an extremely convoluted one, and I want to come to the final point. Let us look at the potential of this form of political violence, eschew moral judgments for another time and another place. I still really haven't made up my mind. And it is precisely here that the prospect for a redressal of compound inequalities is bleak. And let me highlight three reasons why this is so. If we look at Mao, as distinct from Mao in China, as the government, so please spare me, our friends from China, Mao had argued very strenuously that violence is not the main theme of radical transformation. Mobilization of the people is. In another avatar, I had worked on African politics. You look at Mozambique, where they fought Portuguese colonialism. And Samora Machel used to say that before we launch armed struggle, we had 3 months of mobilization. And even more creative was the intervention of Amilcar Cabral in that little country off the west coast of Africa, Guinea-Bissau, who used to go and talk to farmers and first thing, otherwise there's no chicken on your plate. Now this requires time. It requires a lot of space. And it is precisely this space that is denied to the Maoists. I think the Maoists have made two serious mistakes. The first is they've completely underestimated the military power of the Indian state. Bernard de Mello, who is a Maoist sympathizer, has argued that there is no way they can translate those guerrilla zones into liberated zones the way Vietnam did. I mean, in my youth, we were brought up on these stories of how Vietnamese transformed medical, educational, gender relations, and how they gave it a new shape, even as they were being bombed by Portugal and the NATO forces. Now, in a way, the Maoists have no way of setting up alternative social structures because they have been hemmed in by the Indian military establishment, first Operation Green Hunt, and now something called Operation Anaconda, which sounds very, very threatening. The second is that, I think they have grossly underestimated the legitimacy of formal democracy. A democracy is very, very flawed. I think Atul Kohli made that very, very specific, as did Sanjay, as did the other speakers on India, Sanjay Ruparelia. It is extremely flawed. But there is something very seductive about the possibility of going once in 5 years to the voting booth and voting out a government in power. It commands imaginations. Now, Maoists don't come into a neutral no man's land. They come into a village which has its own social hierarchies, its own informal economy of patronage and extortion, and its own loyalties to government. Political loyalties then become a contest between, I'm finishing. And between existing loyalties and loyalties to a cause. However, they just don't have the time to do this. So what is it that they are doing? Whatever they are doing in the guerrilla zones is on the agendas of mainstream political parties, of the CPM, certainly of UPA-1 and UPA-2. So the Maoist agenda has been diminished in two ways. The ultimate objective of launching a people's war has been preempted militarily. All that the Maoists have done is to secure the basic preconditions of well-being, but there is nothing that the Indian government is not planning to do. And our Minister of Rural Development is now seeking to counter politics by technology and by management because he has asked IIM and IIT graduates to go to these areas and advise the government. Finally, if lack of sustained mobilization diminishes Maoism as a development program that delivers benefits, but is by no means cast in the mold of radical consciousness, the use of political violence is also diminished. Because unless politics controls violence, violence begins to control politics. And as Gandhi had said when he wrote his Hind Swaraj in the aftermath of Madan Lal Dhingra shooting Curzon Wiley, he had said, this is what will you get if these people come to power, if we get decolonization? We will be ruled by murderers because the people themselves have not been radicalized into alternative ways of being. Violence without politics is a spectator sport. It doesn't enroll subjects of political action, of agency. It only has an audience. It reduces people to an audience. And violence leaves stigmata, much as the murder of Duncan left blood on Lady Macbeth's hands. What, will these hands never be clean? This is the saga of Maoism in India. Thank you.
Violence is a spectator sport. And unless politics controls violence, violence will control politics. We couldn't have had a better ending to the day than those final remarks by Neera. Floor is open, please. What we're going to do is, I think I'll try and take as many questions as possible, and we'll request by the speakers to please see which ones are the ones that you want to answer, and just go for it. Instead of saying 3, 4 batches, let us just do it at one go. Is that all right? Is that okay by everybody? I'm going to start at this side of the room and move this way. Please be brief if you can. Huh? Thank you.
Yeah, a very short. This is Prabhakaran from former student of New School. A very short question for Neera. You touched all aspects of rise of Maoism. The first phase in the late 1960s, you said, Naxalism. We used to Naxalism and Maoism. Can I use the terms interchangeably?
Well, it's now called Maoism.
Yes. Now it's called Maoism. At that time also. Anyway, at that time, one aspect of the rise of Maoism, cause for the rise of Maoism, I think you did not touch it. That is the intellectuals providing the stimuli to these people. In the late 1960s, especially Western educated intellectuals.
I got your point. Intellectual provides stimuli.
Yeah, and now for them it is very romantic to do so. They are romanticizing Maoism. They have nothing in common with the poor people among whom they are working. So if you can elaborate on what's the situation now? Are there intellectuals behind this northeastern sector where Maoism is on the rise?
Nidhi?
I have one question directed to Neera and a question directed to both of the speakers on India. You evoked Arendt right at the beginning, so I'm very curious. Are you arguing against or... No, let me pose this differently. Arendt's polemic with Fanon is partly a position on violence in the essay, where she seems to be very uncomfortable with the position Fanon takes on the injustice, the historical colonial injustice of violence, and possibly a position Fanon takes on the strategic nature of violence. At one moment in your talk, I sensed you were moving in that direction when you were speaking of the Naxalites. But at the end of your talk, you moved to this really beautiful phrase on politics and on violence, and how when the moment violence becomes a spectator sport, it becomes profoundly apolitical, it would seem. And I really would like to ask you to tease that out. So that's one question. The question to Sanjay and Neera, this may seem cheeky, but it's not meant to be. Are you both saying the same thing?
Can you continue? Yeah. Please, here and then here. No.
Thank you for a particularly good discussion and for bringing this to America also. In this country, the American exceptionalism seems to be so nationalistic that you can't even discuss these things, and even the economists have a great deal of problems in this country because of, actually in this school too is more liberal and gets demonized for it to a certain extent. But these topics to me bring up what I had brought up. I was thinking as you were discussing, and we were discussing before, something I brought up at the UN over a decade ago, the need for minimum standards for at least the developing world as well as this country. And the lack of that, I realized it didn't go over to some of the ambassadors because they had to compete for the lowest cost. And that type of markets-only capitalism, it's not only I that doesn't believe that it's the only type of capitalism or anti-democratic. A capitalist such as Soros, George Soros, has written several books that it's not a perfect economics. It's not, he may not have explained himself as well as he would have liked. But the politics and the need for a different politics, as you had spoken about, and I had represented you in multi-dimensional thinking, that we have to look at these different focuses and the need to create a different politics, and whether you think that the new World Bank president or a discussion on, and actually before I came over, I was looking at an article from the French government, which is not so American exceptionalism pro, that capitalism and globalization isn't always the answer to the way it's working. And don't we have to look at the more critically and more critical thinking and there's a new World Bank president, perhaps for better education and human capital potential help.
Thank you. I think I would, once again, I'll say that if we can keep it, interventions brief, you and then please, Vivian. Then we come this side.
I have a question for each of the three speakers. My first question
Very
goes
briefly.
to Sanjay Rupaia. India has signed many United Nations conventions, including ICPR, International Convention on Political Rights and on Economic Rights. My question is that, like we have signed in Nepal too, and our Supreme Court can ask the government to make laws according to the convention that is signed. Is it the same in India? And my question to Govind Young is internet activities. Is there any way to, how effective is any kind of pressure or sanction to the government, Chinese government, to be effective? In other words, I am a member of International PEN, and every year in the Congress of International PEN, a resolution is passed against internet censorship in China. And they have been trying to pressurize the Chinese government.
Could we have your third question, please, quickly? I'm very sorry, but we've only got 10 minutes
final
left.
question on Maoism.
I think 2 questions are enough. But next, please, Vivian. I'm sorry, we just haven't got time for this, if you don't mind. Please, Vivian. We can't do this. I'm so sorry.
Let's see, Govind, I want to ask you a question about internet activism, and I preface it by saying I'm not an internet activist. I don't blog or microblog or tweet, but I sometimes get drawn in when I read an editorial, and I see how quickly people become, in a way, abusive of not of the target, but of the others. Who are engaged in the conversation. And so Neera suggests that violence may be becoming a spectator sport in India. I think I want to ask you whether internet activism may be becoming a sport for spectators, because it's done anonymously. It's done by people who have leisure. I'm always amazed at the people who seem to have time for this sport. And it's done by people who do often descend into this kind of abuse. So you commented on the conditions for the development of internet activism. I would like to draw you out on what you think the political significance of it, the scope for that might be.
This side, yes. There were some people on this side who had Makarand and then and Mark.
Hi, I just have one question to Neera, and I'm kind of disturbed because the thing is, I'm from Bastar, and I grew up in all those places you mentioned, and earlier we didn't have those boundaries; they were one. Like Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and Naxalism, Maoism actually came to us from Andhra Pradesh, from Warangal, it kind of just percolated. So my question is I don't know, all this sounds very good, but it feels to me that this is something, which is like you're observing from Delhi. So I'm just asking question whether you already been there or, do you have a, experience?
My question's to Sanjay, and you had one of your slides a comment about the politics of representation and representation overcoming or being greater than the politics of redistribution. I guess you said representation and another R word, but anyway, yes, recognition. Thank you. And could you just explain what the dynamics of that are, or as in all, I think, of these laws that you've talked about, 2010, 2011, or at least very recent, is it too early to tell, to make an assessment? I understand it's a preliminary project, but how long do you think it would take to make a, an adequate assessment on the effects of these laws?
Yeah. There's just time for two very short questions, but of course,
I have
please.
one.
Most definitely from you.
For Sanjay, you described rights legislation as a double movement from above, and I wonder if you could push one level above the above that you mentioned, which is that could it be the transnational kind of, law and revolution and human rights movement that partly engineered by the World Bank and the like that really is appearing in India as well as in China, I would say.
Anyone else left? Have you formulated your question? Would you like to just very quickly ask it? Because we can then start the answers. You wanted to ask something about Maoism. Have you?
My question about Neeraj Chandok's paper is, in Bihar, we have a government of Nitish Kumar, who is a OBC, and elections were fought on the issue of good governance, not on reducing inequality, but on good governance, and he won the elections. So my question is, in all these states, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Jharkhand, as you said, a very large proportion of the population is made of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes.
But what's the question?
My particular question is, since 6 decades, why no change took place? Why didn't they...
why such bad governance? Yes, okay, fine.
Throw out the government.
Yeah. Now, can we ask, we've got just about 6 minutes, I think, 6, 7, 8, but please take your time. And would you like to go first, Sanjay? We'll do it in the same order. I'm sorry, but thank you for getting it out.
Well, there are lots of great questions. Let me try to answer them staccato-like. Nidhi's question. Are Neera and I saying the same thing? If we are, she said it much, much better and provocatively. I have 2 very quick answers. One is more raising a point, which actually Neera and I had discussed, and she came to the same point independently. It's very striking that this new rights legislation has occurred exactly at the same time, almost conterminously. 2002, the consolidation of the Maoists, 2004-05, these new rights bills. What does that mean? I think we need to study that more. The second is, there is an area where rights stop, right? Or at least discursively. We don't know operationally. That's what we need research. One thing that struck me is when I was reading about, I was taking notes every day for the last 18 months, 2 years on all this, including the Maoists. Operation Green Hunt, if you read the language, it's so striking. I spent a summer in Kabul in 2006. The language of Operation Green Hunt is the language of NATO's security and development operations in Afghanistan, at least as reported in the Indian press. I'm not saying it's the same operation, but it's really striking. This is about welfare and governmentality, about pacification. It's not about rights. Now, whether it's actually working like that in these regions is, I think, what we need to do research on. Does it work like that? Mark's question about the relationship in recognition, representation, I think there's various ways you can look at it. I think, like, for instance, a particular Marxist critique in India has been the case that, what really matters is redistribution. I suppose I'm more of a Barian. I've struggled to understand the broader Indian left, which is socialist and communist. And I think that, oppression has 2 faces. It's humiliation and exploitation. And what the socialist lower caste parties have been very good at, although they have limits, they don't go all the way down, is about the politics of dignity, self-respect. It has stopped when you get to the SCs, STs. But it has actually had these effects. I would defend that. So the politics of humiliation is not the politics of exploitation. And this actually has been a great blind spot of the communist left in India, which is why I think it's quarantined in its 2 states. And the party of the left that actually has representation, albeit minimal, and UP, Bihar, these other states, is the CPI, which has always understood caste better than the CPM. So transnational influences, I think that's something I'd really like to study more. And again, I would think, I would say yes and no. I think yes, it's very striking. I've just discovered this. World Social Forum in 2003 was in Mumbai. So is that coincidental timing? Does it have something to do with the MDGs, right? And their enunciation in 2000? I mean, does this have any effects? I don't think we have any research on it. It's a really interesting thing to look at. But then I would say no, at least in terms of the long process I'm explaining, what's very striking is the Indian Constitution actually precedes many of these international treaties that you mentioned. Right? The Directive Principles of State Policy in that sense is an advent before the UN treaties. So it's progressive in that way before that. And the second is that judicial activism began in 1980 in this period where people like Ron Herschel and others say that juristocracies are becoming conservative and India was becoming progressive. So it has its own independent causal forces, I think, as well.
Sanjay, may I request? Yeah. Thank you. All right. Is that all right? Yeah.
I have two questions. First question is about how effective is internet activism. There are, of course, measurable outcomes like government responses in terms of change of policy and so on, a number of cases. And one of the better known ones is probably this so-called Sunrigang case involving a migrant worker who was, who died while under police detention. And as a result of the responses from the internet user, but also legal scholars, the government changed the policy regarding the detention of temporary migrants. But that's just one example, and those are not the most important changes, I think. In my view, the changes are broadly cultural change, social change, and in terms of changes of citizens' attitudes to authority. Online, I think there is, in general, a weakening of public trust of government authority. And in that sense, it may be related to a rising sense of political legitimacy. I think that's, in the long run, probably much more important than those isolated cases of outcomes. Social outcome, important in terms of various forms of social organization, online communities that have emerged in the process of these activities. So I think there are a lot of outcomes, so we can talk about, but I don't have that much time. Second question, Vivian's question is about the relationship between spectatorship and activism, which is really important and goes to the heart of internet activism in some ways. And it's an ambivalent relationship in the sense that the importance of spectatorship is one reason or one cause of the growth of internet activism, that participation in online discourse has a performative quality, as mentioned earlier on, and that's, in that sense, it provides a kind of motivation for participation. But on the other hand, it may also have negative effects in the sense of polarization of opinions, the increasing use of verbal violence, and verbal violence, now there is an official term, so-called internet verbal violence, has been used as from the by government authorities as a way of framing what is happening online. Now, online is full of verbal violence, and we should tighten internet regulation. So I think this is a kind of ambivalent relationship, but it's extremely important, and it's also related to the commercialization of the internet. And we also have public firms promoting events, promoting products anonymously. So it's a very important question, I think, but the relationship is very ambivalent.
Thank you. I just want to add to Sanjay's argument in two small ways, two small footnotes, because Nidhi asked me what we have in common. The first thing is that judicial activism, which is pro-social policy, becomes a marked feature of the Supreme Court after the emergency has been lifted and after they have been blasted for supporting the emergency regime. And many observers have argued that this is a way of making up for their own misdeeds during the emergency. They become very aggressive But more importantly, I think 2002 signifies a very important change in strategies of civil society engagement with the state. The first aspect is, of course, the large prevalence of NGOs, and Devesh talked about the exponential growth of NGOs. And the second is, that their strategies are now of lobbying, of media, of networking, but not mobilizing. They're not mobilizing the Indian people. I have been criticized very often of glamorizing social movements, but there is a job that social movements do. I don't think NGOs are interested in that. More importantly, when they are going to the court, then what does this tell us about the relationship between civil society and the state? Because then the Indian state only listens when the court scolds them. Scolds it. All right? Like in 2001 when the Supreme Court said, you guys have so many people starving, and then Vajpayee on 15th August, ramparts of Red Fort says, we are going to enact Swaran Jayanti Swarajgar Yojana, a very complex name. So that is the first point. We have to look at it in the context of changing modes of civil society activism. Do intellectuals support Maoism the way they did in 1967? Yes, that was my generation. A lot of my colleagues left and joined the Maoist movement, and today they are thoroughly disillusioned. There's nobody more disillusioned than Dilip Simian, who now talks about peace in a way not even Gandhi would accept. I think even Gandhi accepts violence as necessary. He said once to villagers who ran away, and he said, you've left your women and children. He said, sir, you told us, Mahatma, you told us not to practice violence. He said, I'll prefer violence to cowardice. Don't do this, So it's a very complicated, very, very complex argument, which I'm hesitant to pronounce on. But today what is happening is two things. Intellectuals appreciate the way this agenda has been foregrounded, because India's success story had written off the plight of its own people, off the script. It had effaced it, and now it's come forefront. Logically, civil society groups should have been doing it if the state, or particularly group representation, it's here it breaks down completely. But at the same time, you can't, accept violence, because this is unmitigated violence, random killings, and as I said, violence consumes its own. You can't get rid of violence. Violence gets rid of you. And it leads to nothing but moral squalor. But then what do you do? And the third important role that many intellectuals have played is publicly appealing to the Indian state not to kill its own children. And the only reason I think the Air Force was prevented from going into these areas and bombing them was because a number of intellectuals came out and said, these are Indian citizens, sit down and talk to them. They are raising legitimate concerns. So I think in a way, the attitude of intellectuals is much more nuanced. Hannah Arendt, there was one aspect of her engagement is with Fanon, but the essay I refer to is the essay in which she engages with student violence in US campuses. I started looking at violence, and the only time American philosophers dealt with violence is during the student revolts of 67 to 72. Then you had pieces in philosophy and public affairs, ethics, all kinds of it. And then Hannah Arendt says, don't reduce power to dominion. There is more to power. And that is what I find particularly interesting, because a lot of our colleagues say, why shouldn't they use violence? Indian society is structurally violent. And this is the courtesy of one philosopher who's become important via the United States of America, Agamben. And I find, if structurally then everybody is violent, then why would you blame the Indian state? Violence is very intentional. It has an agency, it has an objective. The moment you say structural violence, you cannot blame the policeman for torturing suspected Maoists as they have been doing. Have I done field work? No, I haven't. But then I don't do field work. I do political theory. There are two stages of social science. One is gathering facts. The other is kind of figuring out what to do with these facts. And I'm afraid I feed off facts gathered by others. So I'll have to plead guilty to your, yes, the last question you'd raised. Formal democracy is perfectly compatible with social and economic inequality. This is what we have learned from India. And when the state doesn't listen, people have the right to pick up armed weapons against a state. That is a moral question which we'll have to deal with.
What I meant to say was that in UP, there was empowerment of Dalits.
Sir, I said thrice. 3 modes of political intervention have failed in these areas. Group representation, that is their own representatives in parliament to local self-bodies, civil society intervention, and state intervention. They just failed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must now bring this last wonderful session to a close. May I just make one small remark, Neera, if you don't mind?
Please.
I have a position on violence.
I know.
And I think you know it already? Oh, my God.
I was worried about your becoming my chairperson.
You know, my position is perfectly straightforward. I think Clausewitz's maxim that war is diplomacy by other means can also apply to insurrection, provided it does not involve attacks on civilians. I think sometimes violence becomes necessary, a dose of it, to wake up the state. That is, unfortunately, very hard to draw the line. But nonetheless, the line, I know the insurgent movements, including, I think, the Maoists, who've tried to draw this line. And I think it is really important for the state to just to appreciate the attempt. In Kashmir also, they tried to draw the line for a very long time. That's certainly the original insurgency. And if you don't do that, and if you don't respond in time, the insurgency will deteriorate into mindless violence, which is exactly what Neera ended her talk with. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful day. And thank you for staying to the end.
Few more minutes. Please be seated. Just few more minutes. We just want to conclude. Let me first ask, thank actually, Sanjay Ruparelia for really conceptualizing today's conference along with Sanjay Reddy. And now I'll ask him to say a few words of thanks, and then I want to, give overall thanks, to all the people.
Well, what can I say? I think everyone wants a drink if they're not already asleep, so I don't want to stand in the way of the bar. I've learned tremendously today myself, and I think many have as well. We often think at the Institute, the rationale and purpose of the Institute. I think today was a wonderful demonstration, at least from my own perspective, of how much you can learn by putting India and China into conversation. I was struck by how many themes we didn't discuss that actually were parallel, technology being one, even on this panel, the belief in technology. But I just would appreciate, want to say how appreciative we are, especially for those who came from a long way for 3 days, like Neera. I felt very guilty that she was speaking last, and then she gave a barnstormer of a talk, and actually talked about Mao. So that was a perfect way to link India and China. So I just would like to thank you, all of you, for coming. And as Ashok said at the very beginning, this was a central theme of the Institute and its fellowship rounds, and we very much hope that this is going to stimulate a larger collaborative agenda. And we have to do this together. I mean, no one institute, certainly no one set of individuals could do it, and that's what we hope to try to foster today. And so I thank you just for coming and contributing to that.
Yes, just to join Sanjay, I want to thank all the panelists, all the moderators for their wonderful insights. A lot of food for thought. So thank you to all the panelists today, during the day. Thank you. One more. I also want to thank my team, Grace Ho, the number of ICI students who really have worked very, very hard for past month or so. Thank you to everyone. Last, because many of you came from faraway places and many of you will be leaving today, we just want to wish you a very safe journey. Those of you, especially the panelists and invited guests who will be joining us for dinner, we're going to meet at the location, and you have the information, at 6:30. So.